Good morning. Thank you for joining us for our latest Department of Defense Information Analysis Center webinar covering the Minerva Research Engine Initiative study into the U.S. overseas military presence. My name is Steve Rutherford, and I have the privilege of being the director of the HDIAC, and today we're hosting Drs. Carla Martinez-Machine and Michael Allen for this presentation. I want to start off by thanking all of you and saying that I'm grateful to everyone who is taking time out to join us during these very challenging times. I'd particularly like to thank our sponsor, the Defense Technical Information Center. The DTIC-IAC mission is to collect, synthesize, produce, and disseminate scientific and technical information to the DoD and federal government users. So if you've not checked out DTIC's website at www.discover.dtic.mil, take a moment to review their expansive services. Without DTIC's sponsorship, this webinar series would not be possible. Also, I need to go over a few admin notes as we start this out. Please note that all your attendee lines have been muted. So if you have questions during the webinar, we need you to ask them using the chat box on the left-hand side of the screen. And we're going to work to save the last 10 minutes or so of the presentation to go over these questions and discuss them. Please note that this webinar is also being recorded, and we'll provide a link to this recording as well as the slides for members of the HDIAC on our website at www.hdIAC.org for later download. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's presenters, Dr. Carla Martinez-Machine and Michael Allen. Dr. Allen's primary research interests focus on the relationships between asymmetric actors in international relations, especially between major powers and weak states. His research team, with support from the Minerva Research Initiative and the Army Research Office, are researching overseas perceptions of United States deployments through surveys, interviews, and novel data collection. He has published many articles on military deployments in the American Political Science Review, Foreign Policy Analysis, International Interactions, Conflict Management, and Peace Science, and his doctoral dissertation focused on U.S. basing decisions. Additionally, the implications of the Minerva work have appeared in The Conversation, The Monkey Cage, The Owl in the Olive Tree, The Duck of Minerva, and Political Quarterly. Dr. Martinez-Machine is an associate professor of political science at Kansas State University. She received her doctorate in political science from Rice University in May 2012 and her BA from Rice University in economics and political science in 2007. Her research focuses on foreign policy analysis with a focus on military policy and international conflict. In particular, she has been engaged in work on conflict outcomes, defense cooperation, and repression, and has done field work in Europe and Central and South America. Much of her work focuses on the various effects of U.S. troop deployments abroad on host states' policy. Her work has appeared in various journals, including the American Political Science Review, the Journal of Politics, the Journal of Conflict Resolution, International Studies Quarterly, and the Journal of Peace Research, and she has won the Palmer Prize from the Peace Science Society and Frank J. Klingberg Award from the International Studies Association Midwest. It is our distinct honor to host two professors of such stature. With that, I'm going to turn it over to them.
Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. I want to start by thanking Steve Rutherford for the introduction, the Homeland Defense and Security Information Analysis Center for the invitation to present our research in this forum. I also thank you, those of you watching live or later on, for spending some of your time with us. I am Dr. Michael Allen. I'm presenting today with Dr. Carla Martinez-Machine. We are part of a research team that for the last 3 years have had a Minerva Research Initiative and Army Research Office grant to examine how host state citizens view the presence of U.S. service members in their territory. This work is also in collaboration with another co-principal investigator, Michael Flynn, who is also at Kansas State University, but is not presenting with us today. Our topic this afternoon, the political, economic, and cultural effects of the United States overseas military presence, is an attempt to try to get how civilians in other countries form positive and negative attitudes about the United States military. We know that overseas basing creates a ton of different kinds of impacts on a local community. There are massive economic expenditures, economic ties, cultural shock and exchange, environmental consequences, noise pollution, traffic, celebrations, social intermingling, and just a multitude of different things that happen when you put a base on foreign soldiers into a country. For this project, we are really interested in how people come to view that large mass of ties and evaluate their total feelings about U.S. forces in their country. To give an overview of how we are going to proceed in the talk today, we are going to start with a broad discussion of our project and think about why academics and non-academics care or should care, about the implications of our research. We then discuss the theoretical expectations we have for our research in regards to both perceptions and protests, followed by our methodological approach to assess our expectations. We discuss what we find and conclude with some thoughts about what we have learned and what we still want to learn about in this project as well as future projects. The scope of the project is partly a result of where we were when we initially proposed the idea around 4 years ago. Each of us were interested in understanding the influence of U.S. troop deployments on external and internal processes in host states and have published various articles examining the research in macro-level ways. However, quite a bit of existing research was aggregated at a level of abstraction that makes proper inferences difficult. Seeing the calls for proposals by Minerva, we designed a way to not quite get at the positive and negative externalities of such deployments, for there are several, but try to get at how people come to view those different stimuli in their home country. There are several competing processes that bring positive and negative benefits to any individual, and people process that information and come to some assessment as to whether they see the U.S. military in their country as a beneficial or costly force in their lives. So to get at this, we selected 14 countries that had historical or significant deployments in their territory and sought to conduct both large-scale surveys as well as interpersonal interviews with people in a half dozen or so other countries. In the 14 countries, we introduced a battery of approximately 50 questions focusing on demographic, ideological, political, and military-related questions to try to understand people's complex relationship with how they view U.S. deployments. For the qualitative interviews, we visited countries that had historically long deployments or had unique deployments in the country. For example, a humanitarian mission to provide medical aid and inoculations. We targeted active duty service members, journalists, local politicians, and diplomats when interviewing people. Surprising to us, we got a decent amount of buy-in and have been able to interview some high-level diplomats, current serving members of parliament, a former president, and a few bases, or do a few base sites. We had to plan to visit our last pair of countries this summer, but had to delay those plans for obvious reasons. We hope to finish our field interviews in South Korea and Japan in summer of 2021. Beyond the original data collection, we have also collected data that we can geocode and correlate to both survey respondents as well as other existing data. Specifically, we have collected data on targeted historical military expenditures, events data on news reported service member criminal offenses and victimization, and anti-US and anti-US military protests. By using these data sets combined with existing data and the interview data we have collected, we are able to answer several interesting questions about how various events and processes help people or inform people's views of the US military, the US government, and the US people as a whole. In terms of converting our research to consumable products of information, we have been pursuing a mix of strategies in addition to participating in about 12.5 presentations in front of academic and policy-related crowds, including today. We have published a handful of online articles, an academic research article in the leading political science general field journal, and we are currently working on book treatment of our research. We will post a few of those links at the end of our slides. So, why do we care, and why should academics, policymakers, and service members care? Historically, the United States has hosted a sizable number of U.S. forces overseas. The tan color at the bottom of the graph shows you the number of overseas troops, while the green is the total number of service members in the U.S. military. A mainstay of U.S. global grand strategy is a large standing military that has the ability to respond to multiple crises in multiple parts of the world. Converting the previous graph to a percentage, we can see some obvious trends. Conflicts like Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan caused large spikes in overseas deployments for obvious reasons. During peacetime, that number decreases, but it's still a sizable number of troops overseas. Of note, while it looks like the last few years of data are showing a dramatic decline in the number of overseas troops, the Defense Manpower Data Center stops directly reporting the number of troops that are involved in active operations in places like Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq. So the last decline is a bit artificial, but it still can give us some insight to the number of service members that are in peacetime operations. Of course, the locations of the troops is not static over time. The countries that host a large number of troops shift from one period to the next. Japan, South Korea, and Germany remain relatively active with tens of thousands of troops in every period. But you can see the evolving theater of expected operations in 1950 after the Cold War. Well, on the next slide, shows how things are different in 2008, as there is a stronger focus in Central Asia, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Since we see shifts in the number of personnel in any given country, the associated impacts are going to decrease and increase based on how the presence shifts over time. Of course, it's not enough to think about these deployments purely at the aggregated country level and just do a simple count of how many troops are there at a given year. Deployments concentrate within a country, and what communities or populations experience in terms of that impact is going to be based on what sites the United States and the host government agree upon. Japan, for example, is notable for the heavy concentration of Marine bases in Okinawa. The concentration of a sizable population of U.S. service members in a minority population of a country creates more opportunities for that community to experience a concentration of social harms, such as crime victimization and environmental degradation, while the country as a whole reaps the benefits of the public good of security provision. In regards to how international relations scholars are increasingly understanding security commitments in international affairs, some scholars see troop commitments as a part of a contractual situation where a major power can trade an unlike good, security provision, with weaker powers. Weaker powers cannot feasibly offer security provision to major powers, so security alliances and bargains do not really make sense on first glance between a major power and a weak power. What can a weak state possibly offer a stronger state in terms of security? Instead, scholars see weaker states as trading away some of their foreign policy autonomy in exchange for outsourcing their security to the stronger state. In effect, the U.S. has created multiple hierarchies with states based on various strengths, and the deployment of service members to those countries fulfilled the micro foundations of U.S. security commitments. Additionally, the deployment of troops internationally is fundamental to power projection. Troops give the U.S. the ability to credibly threaten potential adversaries and respond quickly to emerging crises. Without proximate forces, the U.S. cannot credibly be a major player in security situations in every region of the globe. Along with security provision as a metric, alliances are not always credible either. Would the U.S. really be willing to sacrifice Washington, D.C. for Tokyo or Berlin? This was a common question when people thought about nuclear deterrence during the Cold War. A similar question arises with conventional deterrence. Would the United States sacrifice its resources and people for the words they agreed to on a piece of paper? The deployment of U.S. service members to a country like Germany or Japan creates a credible guarantee to those states, as any attack on the protected nation becomes an attack on U.S. personnel, and the U.S. would be obligated to respond. When Thomas Schelling famously discusses deterrence and talks about U.S. forces in Berlin during the Cold War, the troops in that city could not credibly repel, let alone survive, a Soviet invasion. Instead, they offer a guarantee that if the Soviet Union had tried to take Berlin, the U.S. wouldn't just go to war for Berlin, but would go to war for U.S. service members that were in Berlin at the time. Through this commitment, even a small force has the potential to be a much larger deterrent. Troop deployments play a similar role today. They are a commitment by the United States to the security of a country, and they have some interesting side effects. The presence of troops in two rival countries may overcome the security dilemma between states. The likelihood that two rivals that host U.S. troops go to war is dramatically unlikely, as the U.S. already has forces in both countries. Instead, the countries can compete and cooperate peacefully under the umbrella of a shared security commitment from the United States. However, bases are contentious. During the Cold War, the U.S. pursued a policy that promoted polyarchy among its allies and would base troops in both democratic countries and autocratic countries alike. Despite initially putting bases in autocracies like Spain, the Philippines, or South Korea during the Cold War, many of these states have gone through democratic transitions. Likewise, more contemporary long-term bases seem to go to democratic polities and not autocratic ones, which is leading to a heavy portfolio for the United States of mostly having bases in democratic states. This alone seems like a good thing. The U.S. is in the business of promoting democracy since the end of the Cold War, and having security guarantees to other democracies makes sense. However, the nature of democratic governance makes the actual job of maintaining a forward deployed presence more difficult. The situation is compounded by traditional allies facing internal and external pressures. Domestically, when negative events come to the forefront, such as drone usage in Ramstein in Germany or criminal assaults cases in Okinawa, there can be a mass upswelling of popular discontent on the respective host government to renegotiate the status of forces agreements or even the whole basing situation entirely. Simultaneously, since 2017, there have been increased demands for NATO allies to give up their defense contributions and current calls for South Korea and Japan to up the amount they pay for hosting U.S. troops, that is, the amount they contribute to burden sharing. So this leads to two consequences. First, when the population of a country sees the basing arrangement as either less positive or increasingly negative, then they will be less satisfied with their government's material or legal concessions to the United States. Asking a country to pay more as the people of a country question whether they should be in the arrangement in the first place may lead to unexpected drawdown of forces in pivotal countries. Second, the negotiation over bases have shifted from less traditional government-to-government negotiations and more towards the U.S. government negotiating with the population of another country. Instead of bargaining with just the elites of another country, the U.S. may increasingly bargain with foreign populations entirely. Finally, while some other countries already do base to a limited extent, the People's Republic of China, identified as a competitor in the national defense strategy, has really entered the basing game starting around 2017 with the construction of a base in Djibouti and is actively looking for new sites in the near future. Notably, the Department of Defense's September 2020 report to Congress on the military and security developments, including involving the PRC, lays out the next possible basing sites for China as possibly Myanmar, Thailand, Singapore, Indonesia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, the United Arab Emirates, Kenya, the Seychelles, Tanzania, Angola, and Tajikistan. So really a mix of polity types. If what we have been seeing is correct, we may be entering a new area where governments compete for the consent of populations to have access to bases in their territory. The United States and China may very well already be in a public relations fight for domestic support for their global agenda, and how people view the security arrangements provided by either country may decide who has bases where. At an operational level, the public view of a base can enable or disable the function of a base. Hostility towards the presence of the base can limit what information flows into the base and provide inaccurate or accurate views of threat assessment in the immediate vicinity. One Air Force base commander mentioned to us that locals like to watch when jets took off for whatever reason, and there was often a half dozen or a dozen people near the airstrip just watching planes when they were expected to take off. However, those flight enthusiasts would also let the commander know if someone new showed up that they didn't really recognize from the local community. This information was just to let the military be aware of a potential concern around the base. Thinking about current trends, there's a mix of forces that might be limiting positive interactions, which allows negative externalities to dominate discourse and news cycles. The post-9/11 security-based environment has made bases more into fortresses with far less community access and increasing trend of having bases meet most, if not all, of the needs of service members. Also, having service members stay on base as much as possible decreases the likelihood for brawls, DUIs, and assault cases occurring in civilian areas. While this has increased service member security and base security, it has decreased the opportunity for normalizing interactions that produce support for the service members within the country. If people perceive a negative externality as fundamentally bad, like news pollution from jets, traffic, or environmental degradation, they don't get the other positive flows that can come from interpersonal contact. One common thing we heard while doing interviews with local journalists and activists overseas is that they think Americans are hiding things on their local base due to the increased security and difficulty of community members to visit or see what's going on. Whether this view is well-founded or massively or is just speculative, the increased mistrust does not help the U.S. military continue its mission. So, what do we expect in our research? We are guided by a few research questions. First, how do combat deployments affect how individuals in the host country view the United States? Second, does this extend to the government or the people of the United States? Generally speaking, from our lines of inquiry, we expect that people's contact with and reliance upon the U.S. military will increase their support for the U.S. presence, the U.S. government, and the U.S. people. This creates two different paths of influence from basing towards host state populations. In terms of contact, a host state citizen is far more likely to interact with a service member of the U.S. military than they are with any other U.S. official. While diplomats conduct formal diplomacy, it is the service members abroad that conduct interpersonal public diplomacy on behalf of the United States. Each interaction they have with a host state civilian, whether positive or negative, creates new frames for those civilians and how they view the military mission, the U.S. government, or the U.S. people. While there are plenty of negative stereotypes of U.S. people and personnel, interactions offer an opportunity to either reinforce the stereotypes or, more commonly, become an opportunity to break down the stereotypes that are propagated by negative news and social media. Each interaction offers new information and possibly creates an environment of tolerance where cultural exchange and understanding can occur. Positive interactions or even normal day-to-day interactions can create the foundations for when people become more willing to learn about and perhaps even accept a group of people they were initially skeptical or hostile to for whatever reason. Naturally, not all interactions are positive, and the ones we are most likely to see in the news are especially heinous and likely to foment negative sentiment. Our expectation is that the majority of daily interactions are benign, and while the negative ones are more likely to dominate discourse and news cycles. In fact, it's the day-to-day interactions and peacetime deployments that may do most of the work. Normalizing service members, seeing them at the grocery store or seeing their children in your school can go a long way to humanizing the people behind the foundations of military power. Obviously, goodwill missions focused on humanitarian assistance, such as inoculations in Peru, or when base commanders promote community service opportunities, can create more spaces for positive perception and overcome negative associations. Notably, we are interested in both what a host state citizen's personal experience is, as well as what their network says about their experiences. It's feasible that someone never meets a member of the U.S. Armed Services, but they have friends or family that have, and those stories from their social networks have influenced their perceptions of U.S. forces. A more obvious route is economic benefits. We expect that people who economically rely upon the U.S. military or otherwise benefit from its presence are more likely to have favorable views. The U.S. spends billions of dollars in other countries, and these dollars permeate local economies. We have had service members, local politicians, local activists, and diplomats all tell us about the effect of U.S. expenditures in local economies and how that affects people's perceptions of the U.S. depending on whether they benefit economically or excluded from those economic benefits. When we were at Air Force Base in the United Kingdom, and Master Sergeant went into very long and great detail about the priority of the base to acquire most construction materials and base operation materials locally if possible to make sure there are a lot of outflows to local communities. There's also in this conversation, we learned about some peculiarities of American culture shock. Apparently only Americans work past 5 p.m. and trying to find emergency, basically anything in the UK after 5 p.m. is exceedingly difficult. There are multiple pathways in which money flows from deployed troops into local economies. While official spending by U.S. government does radically change the local economy, interpersonal expenditures by U.S. service members help to build additional pathways. We have heard multiple stories, both domestically and internationally, about how landlords love the presence of bases, as not only does it mean more people to rent to, but the renting allowance given to service members is public knowledge, and local renting rates either quickly match the maximum allowance, or there's some type of two-tiered system where locals are charged a lower rate and service members are basically charged their living allowance. Local businesses also obviously enjoy the economic benefits of a nearby base as well. While in Wiesbaden, we saw multiple shops with signs welcoming U.S. military personnel and some bars overtly catering to U.S. Army officers by advertising American sports and beer. If I recall correctly, and I forgot to take a picture of it, one of the pubs is literally called American Sports Bar. Regardless, this direct spending has another important effect. In the aid literature, there is an issue that when the government sends aid to another country, they usually want some type of recognition that they are providing a resource to that country. But that often gets lost. Aid money spent certainly can help local people, but that doesn't mean the local people know or even care about who's helping them. However, having U.S. military personnel spending money directly from their own paychecks going into local businesses, and they do so with apparently very obvious accents, and also Americans both stand and sit a very specific way, which I've only recently learned. This overcomes the attribution problem. Local people know that it's Americans spending the money, and not just some nebulous agency that might be helping them. So in all, we have 4 expectations. We expect that people having contact either personally or within their social network with U.S. personnel produces more positive perceptions of the United States military. Likewise, we expect that having economic ties to the U.S. military, either directly or indirectly in your social network, produces more positive perceptions of the U.S. military. We also test whether the positive perception transfers from the U.S. military presence to either the U.S. government or U.S. people as a whole. Do people's views of the U.S. military characterize and transfer basically over to their views of other actors they may think about in the United States? While contacting economic ties are the main thing we are talking about today, we have a few lines of other research that we are investigating for our book project, including how minority populations abroad respond to the presence of U.S. forces, the relationship between troops and protests abroad, as well as the correlates of protecting the United States, protesting the United States or U.S. bases. Finally, we also look at the relationship between criminal offending and victimization and affecting attitudes. Notably, we have a bit of new research on protests, so we want to share that since we have an opportunity to do so today. We will be a bit briefer in this area as we already have a lot going on in terms of what we're presenting, but generally we wanted to test 2 ideas: whether the concentration of U.S. forces encourages protests in a country at a macro level. Likewise, using our survey data at micro level, we are curious if experiential interactions with the U.S. military are more likely to associate with whether people report protesting the U.S. military or the United States. So our 2 hypotheses are at different levels of analysis. At the macro level or the country by country level, we think All else being equal, the number of U.S. service members in a country correlates with a higher likelihood of protest within a country. At the micro or individual level, does experiential events and ideologies significantly contribute to whether people report attending anti-American or anti-based protests? At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Carla Martinez-Machan to discuss our research design, results, and conclusions.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Michael, and thank you everyone for attending. So what I'm going to be doing is I'll tell you a little bit about how we carried out the research, as well as to show you some highlights from our results. And of course, at the end, we will give you some links for those of you who are interested in reading more about this work in more depth. So as Michael mentioned, we have carried out field work in person in several places. So we've been to Panama and Peru, and England and Germany. We were, of course, planning to go to South Korea and Japan in 2020. We have postponed that and are planning to go over the summer of 2021. So during this field work, what we have done is carry out in person and in some cases over the phone interviews with U.S. government officials, mostly from the Department of Defense and the State Department, who are stationed in these countries, as well as with local government officials and also local civil society actors, such as activists or journalists in some cases. As Michael mentioned, we also have a large survey sample, which covers these 14 countries listed here, which we selected based on their large military presence and U.S. military presence, and the fact that it's also historically been a significant U.S. military presence. We also have an additional data collection on overseas military spending, anti-U.S. protest events, which is what I will also introduce here in our results, as well as crime events involving U.S. military personnel, either as perpetrators of the crime or as targets of the crime. So a little bit of an overview of what our survey actually looks like. So as I mentioned, it's in 14 countries, approximately 1,000 respondents per country. The survey itself consists of 50 questions, and it is nationally representative on age, income, and gender. We have repeated it every year for 3 years, from 2018 to 2020, and it has been translated into local languages by professional translators. In particular, our outcome of interest, what in this piece of our research, is the local population's assessment of 3 different groups: the U.S. troops within their country, as well as the U.S. government and the U.S. population as a whole. The way we assess this is by having questions that ask the respondent, in general, what is your opinion of the presence of American military forces in fill in the name? And we ask similar questions about the American government and the American people. Their answer options range from very favorable to very unfavorable, with an option to say, do not know, or decline to answer. The reason we give them that option is because we want people to have the opportunity to not have an opinion, or to tell us that they do not have enough information to answer the question. We then go ahead and group our responses into 4 categories: either a positive response, a negative one, neutral, or that remaining category of do not know, decline to answer, which we find important to model in order to not bias our results by throwing out that last option. Our explanatory variables, the factors that we think are going to affect perceptions of the U.S. military, are going to be either personal or network contact, which we assess by asking the respondent, have you personally had direct contact with a member of the American military in your country? And then a similar question about members of their social network. Our second explanatory variable, the second factor that we think will influence perceptions, is your economic benefit. So have you personally received a direct economic benefit from the American military presence in your country, and we give them some examples such as employment, employment by a contractor, ownership of a business. And we also ask them a similar question for members of their social network. So now let me go ahead and give you a little bit of a preview of what we have actually learned and what some of our results look like. So in terms of how many people in these different countries have had some contact, network contact, or economic benefit from the US military presence, you'll see there from these figures that it's a relatively small proportion of the population. So most people in these countries have not had contact or benefit. It varies obviously by country, somewhere between 10 to 25% of the sample, depending on the question, has had contact or a benefit from the US military. Now, I'm going to show you some preliminary results here. So in terms of how responses are distributed, so these are just modal responses. So each row is responses related to a specific US actor, right? So how do you feel about the troops, the government, or the people? And it's distributed by country, the modal response, the most common response by country, depending on whether you had contact, network contact, benefit, or a network benefit. So I know that there is a lot going on in this figure, but to highlight, for example, a couple of examples, if you look at the upper left-hand corner, for example, we see that people in the United Kingdom who answered yes to having had personal contact with a member of the US military, their modal response for how they feel towards the US military is very favorable, that dark blue, right? Now, to give you another example, if we move towards people who, for example, have not had an economic benefit from the US military, and let's go ahead and look at Turkey, right? And look at how they feel towards the US government, that middle row. So no economic benefit in Turkey. How do they feel about the US government? And what you'll see is that they have a very unfavorable view of the US government. That's their modal response, their most common response. So what stands out about this figure, and you might see that pattern already, is that those columns on the left, people who have not had contact, not had a benefit from the US military, are more likely to give us these more negative responses about their perceptions of all of these actors. Now, of course, there's a lot more going on, and you're probably thinking that there are a lot of other factors that are going to influence people's perceptions. So that is why we are now going to show you some results from our actual multivariate analysis, where we take a variety of other factors into account as well. So in terms of what our estimation looks like, we use a multi-level Bayesian categorical logistical regression. So what's most important about this approach is that this approach allows us to do two things that are very important to us in this case. One, it allows us to consider the probability of giving a positive, a negative, or a don't know response independently of, separately from each other. So we're not just looking at it linearly. Are you more likely to give us a positive response? We're looking at the probability of each one of these responses separately, which is going to be important for us. Also, what this model allows us to do is it allows us to take into account factors both at the individual level that might affect their perceptions of the US military, such as age, gender, or income, but also factors at the country level. So whether you live in a democracy or in a country that is a US ally, that might also affect your perception. So we're going to take all of that into account. So to show you some results, again, I realize that this is a lot of information. So what's going to matter here is that, again, we have our rows telling us whether you've had personal contact, network contact, benefit, and the columns are going to be about their effect on the assessment of different actors, troops, government, and people. So the dots are our coefficient estimate, so what effect we think contact has on, for example, US troops. And the blue dots represent the effect on giving a positive response, the red, the effect on giving a negative response, and the gray, the effect on giving a don't know, decline to answer response, with our baseline category being neutral. So if the coefficient is to the right of that zero line, that means that there's a positive effect on from that variable. If it's to the left of it, it's a negative effect. And we have confidence intervals around those estimates. We want for them to be significant. We want them to not cross that zero line. So again, let me highlight some results for you here. So let's start with the effect of personal contact on your assessment of these groups. So as you can see, having personal contact, responding yes to personal contact, makes it more likely that you have a positive assessment of the US military as well as of the US people. Now, what's interesting is that it also makes it more likely that you have a negative assessment of the US military or of US people. What it makes it less likely is that you respond don't know, decline to answer. So basically, personal contact is pushing people away from that ambiguous I don't know, decline to answer, and making them more likely to say either yes, I have favorable perceptions, or I have negative perceptions of them. As you can see, though, from that upper left-hand corner, the positive effect is actually bigger than the negative effect. So while there is the effect on unfavorable perceptions. So while people get pushed more towards both positive and negative perceptions, that positive effect, being more likely that you to say that you feel favorably towards the US military, is larger. Network contact, similar results, but it's a slightly smaller effect than personal contact, which makes sense. Now, if we move on to economic benefits, here's something that's interesting as well. So we see that there's no significant effect on your positive assessment of the US military or of the US people, but what you'll see there is that there is actually a positive and significant effect on your favorable assessment of the US government. So if you get an economic benefit from the military presence, you're more likely to say that you feel favorably towards the US government, which we find somewhat interesting. The network, there is also a network effect. And so having someone in your network have an economic benefit makes you more likely to give a positive assessment of troops and people, and less likely to give negative assessments as well. So just to sum some of that up, we do find that personal contacts correlates with positive attitudes of the US military and people. And in fact, if you have had personal contact, we see a 15% increase in the probability of a positive response, but no strong attitudes about the US government. And you are also less likely to say, I don't know, or decline to answer. Importantly, there is also a negative effect. People who have had personal contact also have an increased probability of having negative attitudes towards the US military and people, but it's smaller than the positive effect. And this is importantly true even when we take economic benefits into account, either your own personal assessment or the total amount of economic benefits that you get. As I mentioned, there's also a network effect, though it's a little bit smaller. When it comes to economic benefits, we see that having a personal economic benefits correlates with positive attitudes towards the US government, and as well as reduced probability of negative responses about the US people or US military. And again, in this case, we saw a larger effect for network benefits, which is a little bit counterintuitive, and we can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A, about why we think we might be observing this. So that those are the results relating to our primary hypotheses about contact and about economic benefits. And what I'm going to show you now is some of our preliminary results related to understanding both anti-US and anti-base protests. In the case of protest, as Michael was saying, we want to understand both the military presence's causal effect on protest at the country level, right? But we also want to, at the individual level, to predict what is it that makes an individual more or less likely to protest. So I'm going to start by showing you what we have here, which is the directed acyclic graph. And so this is a model that is commonly used in biostatistics and epidemiology. And given that our goal is to disentangle cause and effect in observational data, which is what we have, right? We have observed data. This is going to help us to disentangle these relationships. So we think that all of these variables here have causal relationships with protests. But what we really want to do is disentangle that effect of the troops, of the military presence on protest. So to give you an example, if you look here at that graph, we think that troops in the present time, time t, have an effect on protest in the present, all the way to the right. But also, troops in the past, troops in t-1, over on the left, can affect both troops in the present as well as protests in the present. Another example, being a US ally currently, can affect both your troop levels as well as the probability of protest itself. So there's a lot of relationships that this is allowing us to disentangle. So what we do is we use that DAG theoretical model, and then we run a set of models, first of all, predicting US military deployments, and then we use the predictions from those models to use a series of weights to balance the panel of our observations in terms of different countries' previous experience exposures to US deployments. So basically our treatment history, to put it in epidemiology terms. So in our outcome model, which is what you see here, this is a marginal structure model, what we have done is regress protest events, our dependent variable, on military deployment size, our independent variable here. And we do so weighting the observations using the weights that we generated in the previous step. So the coefficient, positive or negative, which you see there on the x-axis, is going to give us an estimate of the average treatment effect of US deployments on protest activities. So let me point out here different observations. So look at that first panel, the top panel. That one shows us the quote-unquote immediate effect on anti-base protests of having troops on your country, in your country. Panel 3, the third one from the top, is basically the same thing, but for broader anti-US protests. So what you can see from both of those panels, the first and the third one, is that troops generally correlate with more protests. The effect being bigger for that top one, anti-base protest, which makes sense, right? Those are more specific to the military presence. However, if you look at the second and the fourth panel, which show us historical effects, the number of troops before 2 years ago, you'll see from the x-axis that these show a negative effect. So basically, a legacy of troops somewhat inoculates you against protests, while the current level of troops encourages protests. Now, that is at the country level. What I'm going to move on now is to show you some results from predicting how likely it is that individuals are to engage in protests. So we basically run 4 models increasing in complexity using the data that we have from our surveys. We did ask a question asking individuals about their previous protest participation. So what you'll see there is that we start with an initial, very simple, naive model, just showing how likely someone in the population is to engage in protest. Model 2, we add demographics, age, education, ideology. Model 3 is probably the most important shift because we shift from only demographic variables to also experiential data, right? So showing the experiences that you've had with the US military, such as, for example, have you been the victim of a crime committed by a member of the US military? Model 4 also allows us to add country varying coefficients for the demographic variables. So let me show you some results here. So what we do is we use our models to predict whether individuals are going to protest. So each line in these figures, which one of those blue or red lines is an individual. So the ones with the lowest predicted probability from our model are to the left, and the highest predicted probability are on the right. The red lines are individuals who self-reported protesting. The blue lines are individuals who did not protest. So ideally, if our models are working well, we want all the red lines on the right and the blue lines on the left. So again, you'll see that we have our models, some of them performing better than others, but the biggest jump we have is moving from the second panel to the third one. So moving from the model with only demographics to the one that includes experiences. That's where we get the biggest jump in accuracy, with most of the people who do participate in protest being predicted correctly, right? So in terms of assessing our model performance, I'm going to focus mostly on that third column, the false negative column. And so again, you'll see that by moving from model 2 to model 3, so going from only demographics to adding in experiences, what we have done is we've reduced the false negatives. The false negatives are the people who did protest, but the model predicted them as not protesting. And so that adding in those experiences allows us to better predict who protests. And so we think that people are largely motivated by their positive and negative interactions with troops when deciding whether to protest. We actually see this as being good news from a policy standpoint, because you obviously can't change demographics, right? You can't change people's age, for example, but what you can change is the type of experiences that they have in interacting with the US military. And so we, as I mentioned, troops correlate with protests, but the most informative variables in predicting protests are experiential, whereas demographics are less characteristics. Again, policy does matter. So overall, our conclusions from this, sorry about that, up here. There we go. We overall question this initial assumption of a small military footprint and instead find the potential effectiveness of engaging with communities. We find that this project can be relevant not only from the US government or US military perspective, but also relevant for activists and protest movements in showing what are the factors that drive people to be more likely to protest. Sorry. So here I also would like to highlight some of our published work that we have published on this topic. So we have an initial academic article in the American Political Science Review, which is listed there, as well as a variety of blog posts that we have posted, explaining in some cases some of the policy implications of this project. And all of that is available online. As Michael said, we're also working on a book project, and we are in the process of doing that. So I would like to thank you, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Carla, and thank you, Michael, for that very informative presentation. As somebody who's lived and served overseas, I certainly have some practical knowledge of what you're talking about, and it all seems to fit very well. So thank you very much for that. So we have a few questions from our listeners today. Our first one from John Bowling. He asked about training that could be provided to service members to reinforce their role as ambassadors. I think for all of us deploying overseas, that's a classic question. But based on your research, if you were going to talk to a unit that's about to deploy or a family that's about to deploy to live overseas for 2 or 3 years, what would you tell them?
That's a really good question. I'm glad you asked it. And as an academic, I guess I should hedge a little bit in saying that since I have not looked at the military training manuals or meetings or PowerPoints that various service members go through in each of the branches, it's hard for me to speak authoritatively about those in particular, just because I have not directly studied them. I more have seen the outcomes of it. But I can kind of talk about trends I have seen and discuss how maybe that might lend to some better ideas versus some worse ideas. So I do definitely think this is something we should give a little bit more thought to as researchers and seeing what kind of more direct interpersonal advice we can give, as opposed to thinking more at this a global, macro level, global type of scale of US basing. And I should say also a lot of understanding effective training is a trial and error process that has some successes, but also lots of errors. And the people who actually implement training and give advice to individuals probably have a lot of insight to this that I don't currently have access to. And just to get a little bit more arcane here, there are 2 concepts in game theory that I'm teaching a course on game theory next year, so it's always on my mind. One is called min-max, and the other is called max-min. And one is in which you try to maximize, or sorry, the first one, min-max, is when you try to minimize your costs or your negative outcomes. The other one, max-min, is when you try to maximize your benefits. And I think the US historically has only really focused on the former, where we see these bad interactions and the result of them both in the news, protests, calls for removing US bases, and in some cases those have become successful in like the Philippines or Spain. And that is where it becomes more of an absolutist idea. It's like, okay, these bad situations have really hurt us here. They've forced us to withdraw or rethink about how we do our basing. So we should just try to keep service members on base. Don't let them go out to the community, and also don't let people come onto the base and just try to shut down the possibility for negative interactions. And as is clear what we've been talking about today, the result of this is that by minimizing your negative interactions, you lose a whole host of positive interactions that were already occurring in the background, but they're less noticeable because they are day-to-day interactions. People are not going to write a news story about a service member child being in the same classroom as host state civilian children. And so that is important. In terms of a family going overseas or thinking about training training and the like, I think there's been a lot of positive steps forward in how the U.S. has tried to include both cultural sensitivity within training of units going overseas, even especially in combat operations, but also in peacetime operations, and also trying to clean up some of the surrounding areas of basing as well to try to decrease the amount of negative social effects. In another project I was working on, I'm currently still working on, I was talking to a couple of officers about their recent deployments and how things happened off site, like if they went out to go to a bar, what would happen then? And they're telling me their current policy involves having a third member who was not to drink and was basically to oversee and moderate and intervene if situations were seeming to get out of hand. And that seems like a positive thing to have a neutral third party and not imbibing or not drinking and trying to take a handle of the situations to make sure those negative situations don't occur. Additionally, there's also a concept in the military, depending on where you are, what level in the military you are, of kind of a death by PowerPoint, where you have lots of meetings, you have lots of reports you go through, and learning stuff from those And we may even experience this as instructors right now, where we're doing a lot of things virtually, where we're doing maybe a lot of PowerPoints or a lot of lectures online. There's a lot of fatigue with that, where the actual learning doesn't happen as much as you would otherwise want to, because people basically start zoning out the PowerPoints or the person speaking and the like. And so there's something to be said that combining normal instruction with some level of experiential community engagement might have some of those answers. But again, I'm not someone who trains military, but having almost like chaperoned interactions to try to build a culture of understanding what your deployment looks like in the immediate vicinity might also be something valuable. A lot of the people we talked to while we're overseas were very happy with where they were. We were talking peacetime deployments, but we talked about retiring in those communities, loving how the current country they're in was set up and how their children's schools were. And even some of the host state civilians we talked about being the child of a U.S. service member from long ago, and they only exist because of the U.S. basing overseas. And so I think I've said a lot that doesn't directly answer your question, but I think there's a lot to be gained there that can help encourage positive ambassadors for the U.S. mission in that respect. I don't know if you had additional thoughts, Carla, if you want to continue on or have a second question.
We can move on to the next one if you want.
Great. Thank you, Michael. So Bruce Dorinsky asked if you saw any swings in host nation support for U.S. presence with countries that what he calls culturally similar, for example, the United Kingdom, where there's a shared language, and countries that would be considered the first world type of thing, as opposed to other countries where there might be cultural barriers.
Yes, so we definitely did see a variation by country. And in fact, in our full paper, I believe the sense of being in the online appendix, our very long 90-page online appendix, we also run the models separately for the different countries. And absolutely, we find, for example, that in the UK, you get some of the most positive assessments of the US military. Turkey, you get some more negative ones. So that's just from looking at the data. There is absolutely variation by country, and that was part of the reason why it was so important for us to not only be able to run those separate country models, but also control for country level factors such as, are you a democracy or are you a US ally? And in fact, from our interviews, from our fieldwork, we did see a lot of that as well. So for example, when we were in the UK and we were talking to locals as well as to members of the US military, we would get people saying this over and over again from both sides. Well, the reason we have such a positive relationship is because of our shared culture. English was brought up, right? We speak the same language. That makes us more easier for us to communicate with each other. Even if you obviously know that someone is an American, right, that they're not a local, that shared culture, that shared language was mentioned to us as something that facilitated the positive interactions. Now, something that's important, I think, to take into account is that a lot of these countries are becoming much less homogenous as we speak, as time goes by. So, traditionally we think of England as speaking English and having a common culture with the US. But if we look at changing demographics within England, we'll see that more and more it's growing more diverse. And this is part of the reason why we thought it was so important to devote an entire chapter in our book project to looking at minority populations within the host countries, because in many cases their experiences with the US military are going to be very different. And again, we are starting to see some evidence for this empirically, though we're not done with that part of the project. But again, even from our field work, for example, when we were in Germany, one of the responses we got from a base community relations official was that their outreach is targeted towards governors who tend to belong to ethnic majorities, and that there's essentially no active effort to reach out specifically to ethnic minority communities or ethnic minority civil society leaders. And in fact, when we tried ourselves to reach out to some of these civil society leaders from ethnic minorities, we got no responses. And so again, whereas we did get responses and willingness to talk to us from the majority groups. And so, yes, absolutely, I think that can have an influence.
Dr. Allen, do you have anything you wanted to add?
I think Carla covered most of what I would have said.
Okay. All right, I think we have time for one more question. This one comes from YouTube, from Van Anderson, and he's curious about the definition of military presence. Specifically, did you discuss interactions that local nationals would have had with families, or is it just a military service member, we'll say a uniformed service member, or was it writ large an interaction that maybe children had with one another at the bus stop?
The question we specifically ask in the surveys themselves deal with whether or not you are interacting with someone who is directly a member of the military service, as a service member directly. And so we don't in the survey have the indirect path for family-to-family interactions itself. But we did get quite a bit of feedback about that when we do our qualitative interviews. And that's part of the reason why we want to do them, go overseas and talk to people in basic communities, is to try to get that better texture of things that would be harder to quantify directly, but more get a better understanding of how people have these indirect ties that seem to be very important in forming people's perceptions of overseas presence. And go ahead. I think Carla wanted to add something.
Yes, I mean, again, just in terms of the survey, it was much simpler and less ambiguous to ask about members of the U.S. military. But I think Michael is correct that when we actually went and visited some of these communities, we saw that some of the interactions were facilitated, again, by children going to the same school, spouses. I think Michael even took a picture when we were in Lakenheath of a poster where I think spouses were engaging in community outreach in the local town. And so there is also some public diplomacy that families of service members carry out as well, but we did not measure that specifically in the survey.
Well, super. Carla, Michael, thank you very much. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, the slides and recording this presentation will be made available for download at the HDIAC website. For the access to the slides, we encourage you to become a member on the website. Also, if you're interested in learning more about the IACs or getting involved as a subject matter expert or a presenter, or just simply expanding your presence in our user community and our discussion forums, please feel free to reach out directly using the contact information that you're going to see appear on the left-hand side of the screen. In addition to monthly webinars such as this, we also offer monthly podcasts, biweekly email digests that contain the latest in scientific technical news. We also provide a technical inquiry service with up to 4 free hours of technical consulting. And then finally, we can perform customer-funded work in any of our technical areas via our pre-competed contract vehicle. So again, find our contact information in the chat box. And please be sure to join us on 1 December for our next webinar, which is titled DNA as a Molecular Engineering Platform for Defense Applications. And that one's going to be given by Dr. Steve Armentreau, CEO of Parabon Nanolabs. Parabon did a fascinating webinar for us some months back on forensic DNA, and I think this will be another good one. So thanks, everybody, for your time today. Carla, Michael, thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedules to share your research with us. We look forward to hearing more about it as you continue to run down this path. And we ask everyone to like us and follow us on social media as well. So best regards to all and stay well. Thanks.